Well then, because we don't like to keep our speakers hanging around for too long and getting nervous or something like that, we're going to go straight into introducing Peter Olde to you. Peter is a life member of APS New South Wales and a long-time supporter of regional branches, including Sutherland, Macarthur and Menai. Earlier this year, his work with Australian native plants was recognised with the award of Order of Australia Medal. So he's now Peter Olde, OAM. I don't think you have to bow or curtsy, but practice if you need to. We're very glad to share in the reflected glory of this recognition of the importance of Australian plants. And of course, Menai Group is fortunate to have him in a leadership role for the next year. We all know the Olde family for their generosity in sharing their Oakdale gardens with us all. And of course, Peter is the co-author of the Grevillea book, all 3 volumes, which was published in 1994. But he has an interest in more than Grevillea. In 2015, he co-authored a study into Heikia. Since that appeared, people have been asking, what's happening to Heikia? So that's the title of Peter's talk tonight, and he aims to give us an update to the taxonomical position of Heikia. So over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Pam. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
I'm not sure of the technology here, whether I'm going to work this out or not, but we'll play with it as we go along. And I have prepared a slideshow for you, and that I just wanted to introduce or give an indication about why I'm talking to you about this subject, because there's been some fairly unprofessional behaviour in the botanical community, and at the situation as it is stands at the moment because of COVID. Research that's being expected to be completed has not fully done so, and therefore we don't really know what the situation is. Now, this is not the first time that Hakea and Grevillea have been confused, and in fact it's such a long tale about confusion that leads us to the question of whether Grevilleas and Hakeas are actually the same genus, whether they are a group of plants that evolved at the same time and are now monophyletic. So these things were tested, but I thought the results have probably well been known that Hakea is deeply nested in Grevillea, as it is currently constituted, and the result of that is prima facie that all Grevilleas should be renamed Hakea, because even though it's Hakea that's nested inside Grevillea, Hakea name has priority taxonomically and nomenclaturally, and the story is that they should actually be, on that result, transferred to Hakeas. Now this would cause considerable upset to commercial users, end users, and would not only that, require amendments in herbaria because of the large nature of Grevillea, which is the 3rd largest genus in the Australian flora. To have all their names changed to Heikia is not something that one would do without having a little bit of better research than we had. I'll come on to that a little bit later, but I just thought at the moment I'll go back through to the history of Heikia, otherwise we'll be finished in 10 minutes, to give you some idea of the story behind it. And also, I've prepared a number of just quick slides of the beauty of Hakea, which is one of the most beautiful genera in the world, and it's equivalent to almost equivalent to Grevillea. And you'll see why when I show you these slides, and I invite you to get involved, as you know, to a greater degree than just jumping up down to the nursery and buying a Hakea or two. The first Hakea was actually collected by Banks and Solander. They collected 3 species, and they took them back to England, as you know, with all the other collections that they made. They made 4 collections of Grevillea at the same time. And when they went back to England, they were preparing to prepare a large book on the subject of their travels. And while that was going on, the plants that they were going to talk about were being engraved, which was the way that they would produce them. And Solander was going through naming all the plants, so that when the time came, then the book would be a very professional affair. Now, this project took such a long time and was so detailed. The fact is, in Banks's own time, it was never, ever published. He died in 1820, and by the time he died, many of the things and the plants that would have been novelties if he'd published promptly were well known and had been already described by other people. And Heikia was one of them. Heikia was named by a fellow called Schrader in Germany in a book that was titled Certum Hanoverianum Supplante Rariores. I won't read it, I'll just tell you what that means. It means the jewel of Hanover, or rarer plants which are cultivated in the royal gardens and neighbourhood of Hanover. And that publication came out in 1797. And the reason it was able to come out was because the seeds that they had collected, Banks had collected at Botany Bay, we presume it was from those seeds, may have been others, were sent to Germany in some way, and they were growing there. And indeed, quite a large number of Australian plants were named from cultivated plants. And Hakeas started out that way as well. Now, we don't know whether they were Banks's seeds, because by 1797, there was quite a large trade in seeds and there were quite a large number of people. But Schrader indicated in the book that the plants came from Botany Bay. So that's a fair indication that, because Banks was a very generous guy, and he often loaned his specimens to botanists, visiting botanists and so on, while his book was being prepared, probably a little bit foolishly, I think. Nonetheless, it's interesting to know that the work was actually published in 1988 by Electo Press, and there was a big launching of that publication in Sydney, if I recall, when it was done. Now, Solander named the plants from that expedition as Leucodendroides. Leucodendroides means nothing much, because it's just that these plants looked like Leucodendron, which was a genus that had already been named. And it's interesting to note that not only Grevillea, but also Hakea were named as Leucodendroides. An informal name that has never been published, but gives some idea as to the way people were thinking about these plants at that time. Of course, the plants in Heikia weren't just named in Heikia. It's a very interesting story, really, because the first Hakeas were actually named Banksias. Richard Salisbury named quite a few of them, And he named them and gave them epithets in Banksia. And it's those epithets that have priority, even though the genus hadn't yet been described. So Schrader recognised 3 species. Hakea glauca was one. Hakea sericea, which was actually the only name to survive into the present. And Hakea pubescens was the other. Those 2 names, pubescens and glabra, Hakea glabra is actually Hakea teretifolia now, because Salisbury had named it Banksia teretifolia. And then along came Gärtner and then renamed it Lomatia teretifolia. And then what's his name, James Smith, got the idea. He knew that Schrader had named the genus Hakea, but he liked the idea that they should be named Conchium, named after the shell because of the fruit, shape of the fruit. And he went ahead with it, even though he was a bit doubtful. And everybody jumped in on top of him and started to name their species in Conchium. And it wasn't really till about 1808 or 1809 that the genus Hakea actually got established at around the same time as the genus Grevillea. So it was Robert Brown's authority really that enabled this, because he was being looked up to at that time as the great guru. Now, I'll just share my screen with you a little bit. I'm going to have to do this, I think, individually. I'm not quite sure how this is going to work, but if I share my screen and give you this image here, this is Hekia teretifolia. Some of you will know this, of course. And can you see that whole screen or not? I can't hear you, so what am I doing wrong?
Yes, we can, Peter.
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Thank you. These are the players. Robert Brown on the left, Richard Salisbury up there on the right. We have no photo of Richard Salisbury. He's a very interesting man, and his name and the history of Richard Salisbury and Grevillea has been written about, but he was a very cantankerous, unpleasant sort of chap. But he was at the time the leading botanist in the Proteaceae, because he had written a number of books and a number of papers. And then came along Robert Brown. Robert Brown was a young doctor who got the gig to go to Australia. And it turned out he was a masterful stroke, because he was a very intelligent and able botanist. But of course, this got Salisbury out of his nose, out of joint. I don't think he was upset about the fact that he was entitled to write up his own work. But what happened was that Banks and Brown excluded Salisbury from any participation in the nomenclature of the Proteaceae while Brown was working on that work. And other people also tried to publish, but Brown was very, very strong on people not doing so. And I can understand that Salisbury had got his nose out of joint, because there were lots of plants coming into cultivation at that time, and Salisbury was keen to name those, and he had every right to, in my opinion. The fellow down here on the bottom is Schrader. This is the only photo, I think, that we have of him. And the one in the middle here, J.E. Smith, was probably the leading botanist anyway, with Brown in England at that time. And he was the man who authored the genus Conchium. Along came John Lindley about 20 years later, 30 years later, and he named Hakea pilulifera, which was actually a Grevillea. And already we can see the problems that have started to emerge, because unless you had the fruits to diagnose the genus, you were liable to make mistakes because the flowers were all very similar. William Hooker also made a mistake. William Hooker is this is what I'm talking about here, the most senior botanist at the time. And he named Hakea trisecta, Grevillea trisecta, sorry, which was actually a Hakea, Hakea purpurea. And then came Mueller, who named Grevillea trinura, which was actually Hakea trinura. Again, the same problem, they didn't have the diagnostic fruits. So those people and others were involved as well in the confusion that reigned really right up till the time of Bentham. Bentham, just speaking about Bentham, Robert Brown, first of all, was the first, I should say, to actually draw attention to the fact that there was a problem here, because he named a plant called Grevillea laurea, which actually had to change that name when he got the fruits into Hekia laurea. And he also said that that Grevillea glauca could well be a transitional species between Hakea and Grevillea. So as you can see, they're so very close in many ways. The question about whether they actually are the same was worth exploring. Bentham made the remarks pertinent to this morphological separation of Hakea and Grevillea, noting that there was no one organ in which the two genera are absolutely distinct, excepting the seed wing. And even that, although essentially terminal in Hakea and annular and present in Grevillea, is exceptional in Hakea platysperma, where the wing is almost of equal breadth all round the nucleus, but even there the texture and venation of the wing is that of Hakea, not Grevillea. And the two genera are, with few exceptions, so natural that there are very few species that would not at once be referred to the right genus, even without the fruit, which I'm not sure about that, George, especially as the wing of the seed can generally be traced in the ovule immediately after fecundation. And Robert Brown was the one that, he was the great microscopist who looked at the ovules, and he could see the wing developing, but only in the species that were known at the time. Now, we jump then from the early history of Hakea to the revision that was conducted in the Flora of Australia by Bill and Robin Barker and Laurie Hagee. And this is a very well-written work, in my opinion. About 150 species were recognised, as they had been, as they were discovered by various people through the century before. You note that it's 1996 to 1870 is 126 years since anybody really looked at the work that had been done by Bentham. And it should be noted that Bentham is quite a lumper over many species. Now, they recognised 150 species, but there was still this problem about how do we tell them apart. And really, it was Laurie Johnson and Barbara Briggs who published in the answer to that question, or the the answer that we accept today, although I'll speak about that in a minute. And that is that the fruits of Hakea are hinged at the base, like, where did I write this? Like this. See how they separate down both sides of the fruit and are hinged at the base. Now, that is a diagnostic character that separates Hakea from Grevillea, provided you're a morphologist. That's provided you've got fruits. And unfortunately, it doesn't work where some species don't have fruits at all. And so people decided that they would go and look at the genetics. This is a good photo because there's a few things about Hakea that are almost always true, but not quite in every case. You'll see that here we have two woods. A secondary wood is this light wood, and the primary wood is the one that the seed would be embedded in there. And there's the wing right out there. It's eccentric from the terminus of the seed. And that is almost universal in Hakea. The other thing about the fruits, and it is the fruits that really do separate them, is that they are thick and woody. There's even two types of wood there. And they are serotinous, so that means that they are perched up in the canopy of the plant. And although that happens in Grevillea to some extent, the fruits in Hakea generally do not open until there's a fire or the branch dies. So those diagnostic features, another feature is that the texture of the outer surface of the seed embedded in that hole there sits as a rough outer exterior to the seed of Hakea generally, and not in Grevillea. So there are quite a few things that that people should look at. But it's also been said that Hakea has a glabrous style and a sessile ovary. If you add all these things together when you're looking at your plants, then you would have little trouble, I think, in rendering them. But there is no, as Bentham said, not one single character that can be used to separate them. So as I said, we go to the genes, and Hakea has been analysed genetically and has been found by Barker and others who did morphological work. Barker suggested that the relationship with Hakea was actually with Grevillea glauca. He mentioned that same species that Brown mentioned in 1810. But when they analysed it genetically, they found that there was a very distant relationship with Grevillea glauca. And so it just goes to show, yet again, that morphology can play tricks with you, and it's not a good idea to follow it necessarily, although it can be helpful at times. The idea of a single character is all very well and good, but I should mention to you that apart from the study showing that Hakea is monophyletic, that means that they are all most closely related to each other than to any other species, and that they evolved in a single evolutionary event and multiplied and diversified from that event. In relation to Grevillea, which they're closely related to, the separation is not so clear. And it's felt that now, from the results that were done by Austin Mast and co. in 2015, that Hakea is actually nested deeply inside a monophyletic group, deeply nested inside Grevillea as it is presently comprised. So the results of that study really made us think that we should, or made everybody think that we're going to have to transfer Grevillea to Hakea. But the authors, and I was one, hesitated on this terrible problem that would be introduced to Australian botany and horticulture if those names were changed. And it's very interesting at the time that we found a paper was being prepared from a grant by a fellow called Marcel Cardillo in the ANU in Canberra. And he shared with us some results that showed that if we took some of the plants out of Grevillea, I won't give you any further detail on that, that we could make Grevillea and Heikia 2 monophyletic genera. And we decided to pursue that. And indeed, from 2004, I have been collecting in Western Australia, New South Wales, wherever I go, genetic material of every species of Grevillea that I can, because unfortunately the paper that Mast produced, Mast only looked at 5 genes. At that time, 5 genes was enough. Everybody said, look, even if it doesn't produce the same result every time, you'll get a pretty similar result. Doesn't matter what 5 genes. And I just think it's been shown now that is not correct. We need as many genes. In fact, all the genes, I think, is what we ultimately need. But in a big genus, it's very difficult and expensive to do that. So we have to be selective, and Marston & Co. Selected 1 or 2 species from each morphological group that had been set out in the Flora of Australia and by myself and Neil Marriott. And they tested those species and found, gave the result, but the result, even though we say it was deeply nested, the topology of the tree that was produced showed that the results required very careful thought, because it didn't separate them into the groups as we would have liked. And in fact, it actually showed that very early on in the evolutionary process, the actual pathway of evolution was obscured, and we weren't able to be definite about how it happened. So the study was an excellent study, but it is actually flawed in its results, so that we could not be definite enough. The groups that it put plants into were not always morphologically coherent. And some plants were put in groups and you could actually not, accept that they were actually closely related. So we knew there were some problems with it. So we decided not to publish the names of Grevillea in Hakeas, and we would hold off for the results of this bigger study, in which we were going to test every Grevillea that we could and every species and subspecies in it, recognised species and subspecies, such that we could identify the real answer to this question. And as I said to you, Cardillo shared partly his results with us, and we were very happy about that. There's some very, very interesting results going to come up out of this, but of course there's still another 200 or 300 species to be done. And COVID has shut the universities down, and so it's been delayed for at least another year. So we can't actually, we can't really answer that question. However, in the way of things that history is bound to repeat itself, as you know, I said to you, Richard Salisbury was very keen to publish names and plants in Grevillea and Proteaceae generally in around 1809, ever since he'd been excluded by Banks and Brown from doing so. And it really got his nose out of joint. And so when Brown began to read the results of his work before the Linnaean Society, Salisbury was in the audience and listened to this talk, which actually extended over 4 separate readings up to March 1809. And then after that reading, nothing happened until no publication came forward. So Salisbury had been preparing his own version, an inferior version, true, but his own version, there's no doubt, very different to that of Brown. After listening to the paper, he incorporated some of Brown's names but not all of them in his paper. And when he incorporated them, generally he attributed them. So it was alleged after he published his book on the Proteae in December 1809, ahead of Brown, that he'd actually sat there and stolen Brown's work and had renamed all the plants that he felt he could name, and that this was a deliberate and antisocial act. And from that time, Salisbury was excluded from social circles, botanical circles, although he was allowed to go into Banks's herbarium. And this has been promulgated, this exclusion of his work, where none of his species were going to be recognised. This has been promulgated for centuries. And it's only in recent times where people are going, now, hang on, this is not fair. Salisbury paid a heavy price for that mistake. And even if he wasn't a nice person, that was too heavy a price. And he had his own reasons for doing what he did, and they were justifiable. And so those names have priority by, I think it's 4 months, because Brown did not publish until 1810. And of course, it infuriated the establishment in England at the time and throughout the world. And we're just sort of getting back to a more stable situation now by the recognition of the plants that he pre-published. Now, the thing is, why is that interesting here in 2019, actually 2018? In 2018, the results that came out of Austin Mast and Co.'s reworks, which showed, as I said, Hakea deeply nested in Grevillea. Along came 3 botanists, 2 botanists, principal botanists, and a botanist that should have known a lot better, and they transferred all the Grevilleas into Hakeas. Not only did they do that, but they raised all the subspecies into species. And so they have actually now, being the last published word, actually have all the Grevillea species with Heikia names. Now, this is, in today's terms, absolutely devastating, because it has taken away the rights of the botanists for naming rights for plants. There was absolutely no consultation with the authors. They just went ahead and did it without, I guess they thought that we were slacking and that, we should have got on with it. It was a very selfish, self-centered act. And unfortunately, there hasn't been any backwash public that I've seen published about their work. People have just sat on it. The fact is, if Cardillo's work is unable to show, when all the plants are tested, that actually we can separate Grevillea and Heikia, then the work of these people, Christian House and Bing, will stand, because it has priority in Heikia because of the names that they put forward in 2018. So the situation then is, there's a bit of flux, a little bit of uncertainty. We don't really know whether we're going to be able to recognise Grevillea separately. We surely hope to. If we do, we have found some very interesting groupings that will be cut from Grevillea. I think it's around 30 to 50 baby species. I haven't counted them, but there's, I got an estimate of it. And if we can't do it, it's going to be a very sad day for botany, I think. Anyway, the only thing I do agree with about Kristen House and Bing is that they've raised all the subspecies to species. So in Grevillea, this is a problem that I personally have with a lot of the taxonomy of that group. But for the moment, then I all I can say is that we are going to continue to recognise Hakea. The Australian census, plant census, does not recognise the work that Kristen House and Bing do, but as you can see, they could very well have gazumped us with their very cheeky proposal. And I just think that it's the sort of thing one would not normally expect in botany today. Now, I've got a few sort of slides here, which I thought I'd show you how incredibly beautiful this genus is. Arguably, that is the most ugly, beautiful plant that I've ever seen, Hakea aculeata, and I sure wish I had one in my garden. Prickly as you can imagine, very, very prickly from Western Australia, but the flowers all sit on these little branches all around. Now, it won't serve any purpose if I make a commentary on every one of these, so I'm just going to flash them up. Can you see them? Hello? Right, okay. Hekia amplexicalis, Western Australian, New South Wales. This beautiful plant has been, one of the features of Hakea is that the leaves, both sides of the leaves are the same. It's called similofacial, whereas in Grevillea, mostly the leaves, not always, unfortunately, mostly the leaves differ. They're dorsiventral. The top of the leaf is different to the bottom of the leaf. And of course, our old friend Hekia bakeriana from the Central Coast, and its massive fruits is a delight to most horticulturists. The flowers are hidden within the plant, and it's kind of messy, but it's a kind of attractive plant at the same time. Hekia baxteri doesn't really show how incredibly beautiful that sculptured leaf is. And they are borne on erect floral branches or erect vegetative branches, really, that are just sculpturally so beautiful. Unfortunately, they're also very prickly, those little teeth, and it hasn't really taken off, I don't think. This is Hakea bucculenta, another very attractive, notable for against similar species by its very narrow leaves, and usually it's got orangey red flowers. Hakea cordifila. I won't go into these groups. Come on. Hakea francesiana. I got used to calling this plant Frank, and it seems to stick quite well. You'll notice it differs in these broader leaves. That's one of the distinguishing features of the Hakea francesiana, very widespread species that extends through the drier country in South Australia and Western Australia and the Northern Territory, I think. Hakea cucullata, this is one of the plants that Robert Brown collected at Albany when he was there. It's fairly widespread south of Perth, along the south coast particularly. And these beautiful flowers are little shell-shaped leaves. Very, very nice plant. Hakea corymbosa. All the flowers all head at the, cluster together in heads, in what we might call corymbs, and that's the source of the name. Western Australian species, I grow that species, and it's quite a hardy plant. Hakea dactyloides, you know that plant perhaps if you're a Sydney sider, and you can notice the beautiful venation. I like this photo because it's all backlit, and you can see the secondary and tertiary venation in the leaves, which is quite interesting. They are both the same, both sides. But another feature of Hakea there is easily shown. Again, I'm talking about getting characters that in combination show Hakea. So you notice how the flowers here are all clustered around the axils of the leaves, very close to the stem. You do not see that very often in Grevillea. And it's a feature of distinction, in my view, for a lot of the Hakeas, but unfortunately not all. Hekia drupacea, I can remember growing up with Hekia suaviolens, and that was a common plant planted even in Sydney, a West Australian plant, and very, very, very hardy. But it's had a name change. It's now Hakea drupacea. I won't go through all the authorities, but clearly the epithet survived an earlier naming than Hakea suaviolens. And then Hakea eniaba, which comes, again, as it says, from eniaba, but it's more widespread than that. And it's a very lovely plant. It's never been introduced to cultivation apart from a few enthusiasts, and it's declared rare, although I thought it was more common than they were alleging. Hakea florida, again, notice the leaves are the little flowers all up and down the stem tightly. And Hakea costata, ribbed Hakea. It's a beautiful Hakea. These flowers, you cannot see the leaves. They just so dense up the stem and just completely shut the leaves out when they come into flower. It's a really lovely plant. And Hakea florulenta, this was named by Meissner from collections by Robert Brown, by James Drummond, sorry. And Hakea gibbosa, one of the earliest named plants, which was the name of Hakea pubescens at the time. Very, very few Hakeas have hairy flowers, and this is one that does. Hakea gilberti. When you go to Western Australia, you can't miss this plant because fairly widespread. It is the most brilliant white that you can believe. It shines. It is so absolutely dramatic. It hasn't really done well in horticulture because those leaves there are among the most sharp that you'll ever see. And I don't know if you can see the little spine there, but it's straight, it's rigid, and it's very, very sharp. Will puncture your skin easily. Hakea gilberti. Here's Hakea grammatophylla. This is a plant from inland, from I think it's South Australia as well, Western Australia. And it's a tremendous horticultural plant. I'm growing this in the garden and it really does shine. It's not as tall as Hakea frank, but it is really justified in the garden. It's just a very sort of beautiful plant. And of course, Hakea laurina, the pincushion Hakea. And those little balls there, they come out when they come out, and I found it difficult to flower this when I was living in Sydney, but see these buds here, the buds would just fall off. They never went developing. But eventually I did get one to flower in Sydney, and I noted that, and I cut it because I put it in my mother's room and she was dying, and the flowers were very tight, like a tight cushion. But over weeks and weeks, the flowers opened and the styles all came out. So it actually matures in the vase, which is a nice thing to know. The blue Hakea, Hakea lemaniana, this is an acquired taste. A lot of people in horticulture of Australian plants really love this plant, but the only feature, I think, is the blue flowers, which are not really that blue, although in some populations they're bluer than others. Again, very sharp and pungent. Hakea laurea. You can understand why Brown called this a Grevillea. The reason was that he didn't have fruits. And it was only when he had to change the name and so change the authority there in 1830, after he got fruits, that it became clear that it was actually a Grevillea, a Hakea rather, not a Grevillea. Hakea maconikiana, I've got this growing. It's a rare plant and very unusual plant with very thin leaves, long leaves, very erect plant. and Hekia microcarpa. Now, I didn't put the fruits in, but I was running out of time to get this together, but has the tiniest fruits of Hakea, any Hakea. And Hekia Minima, again, this was described by McConaughey. It's a really quite an easy plant to grow, actually. We've got this in the garden here at Oakdale, and it's a very beautiful plant. And Hakea myrtoides, again, another lovely Hakea. I keep going to say Grevillea and beautiful. They seem to go together. And so I have to keep biting my tongue when I'm dealing with Hakeas. Here's Hakea neurophylla. That's also a very lovely Hakea with more ball-like inflorescences. And you'll notice how they're stuck up against the stem also. It's a very strong feature, really. Hakea nitida, the shining Hakea. That's the name that was on the slide, but I'm not 100% sure actually that's properly named because the leaves don't look to be terribly shiny to me. And Hakea obtusa, Burrendong, Grevillea Burrendong Beauty, came up in a batch of seed that was supposed to be Hakea obtusa, Peter Olde told me, and it looked a bit different, and it turned out it was a hybrid with Hekia Minima. Hakea orthorhyncha, the bird's beak Hakea, prolific seeds are set by this, and these strong pointed fruits that are a feature of the plant. It grows well in Sydney and can be easily obtained because of all the fruits it sets. And Hakea pendens, this is a very unusual Hakea. I don't know anyone who's managed to get it, but it's a species out there. It was named in, I think, 96. And Hakea rhombales grows in a very dry country inland of Western Australia. It's fairly widespread. Goes down into South Australia too, I think. But again, it's not widely cultivated. And I'm going to terminate the talk here with a very lovely Hakea from the Fitzgerald region, Hakea Victoria. Notice it's not Victoriae, it's Hakea Victoria. And it was actually named by James Drummond in an article, a newsletter paper article. This is the Hakea that when he saw it, Drummond was so entranced by it that he got off his horse and he was way down the Fitzgerald area and he got a big branch of this and he carried it all the way back to Perth. It shows great love of the flora. And as you can see, the coloration there in the leaves cannot or does not usually get replicated in horticulture. But in the wild, when you go out, this is what the plants look like. Now, I'm going to terminate the talk here. If you have any questions on what's happening to Heikia or anything about Heikia, and I don't pretend to be an expert on it, please direct your questions through the chair. Thank you.